The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world, and those who dwell therein. For great is God's steadfast love toward us. God's faithfulness endures forever.
Sing praises to God, sing praises, for God reigns over all the earth. Let us worship God.
After the singing, we will remain standing for the convening prayer. Gracious and all-loving God, send us into the world of humanity to sow the seeds of peace and to seek for the harvest of peace. Grant us a gentle spirit, even in the midst of violence and the threat of violence. Help us each to be a peacemaker. In the name of Jesus Christ our Lord we pray. Amen. A few words from Paul's writings which seem appropriate for the theme of the day from Galatians. For you were called to freedom, friends. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love be servants of one another, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you are not consumed by one another. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit. Let us have no self-conceit, no provoking of one another, no envy of one another. These are the words from St. Paul.
Each of us in this room today is, in a very real sense, a citizen not just of a particular locality or state or even country, but rather a citizen of the world. Now, that's hardly a unique observation. After all, most of us in this room were raised in a tradition which taught us that we are our brother's or our sister's keeper. However, for much of history, the sense of brotherhood has, almost by necessity, extended to a rather limited geographic region. It's, after all, rather difficult to feel any sense of relationship with or responsibility for or sympathy with events that are going on around the world, half a world removed from you, in places you've not heard of before, and being experienced by people whom you will never meet nor even see. But that's obviously changed over the last couple of decades. And it's now the case that it's easier for me to travel halfway around the world to the capital of the People's Republic of China than it was for my great-grandparents to travel to the neighboring state. It's now possible for me to turn on the television set and through CNN or the other networks to observe as they are happening events that are an entire world away. So this sense of what it means to be a citizen of the world, I think, is rapidly expanding. And one of the goals of any education, I would certainly hope, is to introduce students to what that idea means, to help them understand that they are, in fact, related in a very intimate way with everyone else in the world. Now, as an abstract idea, it's easy to talk about that. But what we are here to do today is to listen to and to talk with, at the end, a speaker whose life has embodied that notion and who is actually living the idea that we are all related to each other and that we do indeed have responsibilities. Amnesty International is one of the best-known organizations, not just in this country, but throughout the world, an organization that cares about other people and about our responsibility to those people. And I am very pleased to be able to present to you today Mr. James O'Dea, who is the Washington Director of the Amnesty International Office. Mr. O'Dea.
Take my jacket off. Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here, to thank Bob Ferguson and Marie Binder and all those people who helped get me here. The subject I chose, or the theme I chose for this morning's presentation, was Free at Last, words for both prisoners and human rights activists. And we could really say, echoing the words of the pastor, also words for peacemakers. What does free at last really mean for both the unfree and those who think that they are free? That is really the challenge that, as I see it, we have to live and breathe and work at. In my work in Washington, I meet with, on a daily basis, senators, congresspeople, State Department officials, White House officials, representatives of foreign governments, whether they be ambassadors or special representatives. And we try to push some very small concepts about the rights of people around the world. And when you think of freedom, let me just give you a sense of what it's like for many peoples around the world. When we go to these elected officials, we go begging for basic things. We go begging for people's lives, the lives of men, women, and children, who are not free in any sense of the word. There are those who are imprisoned because of their religion, because of the color of their skin, because of who they are and what they are, because of their identity, because of their sexuality. Basic things in many, many countries that people are imprisoned for. And we say to those who are imprisoned, who have never used or advocated violence, set them free. They are prisoners of conscience. We all know and can think of easily people like Andrei Sakharov, who epitomize the prisoner of conscience, the person who was imprisoned for breathing the ideas of freedom when there was no freedom in the Soviet Union. But there are many Andrei Sakharovs. The prisons of the world are filled with people who are struggling to be free in their own countries. And we don't know about them, and we need to learn their names. Let me just tell you about one who is not very well known and who died and who was killed by his government. His name was Muhammad Taha. Muhammad Taha was a Muslim, and he lived in the Sudan. But Muhammad said, all the religions, everybody should respect each other. And women are equal to men in every sense and should be treated as so within the law. And the state of Israel should be recognized by the Arab countries. And for those thoughts of freedom and tolerance and respect, his government took him and executed him when he was in his 80s. And here was a man who epitomizes that. He was imprisoned and then killed by his government for thinking freedom, for thinking equality and respect for people. And we need the people who believe that they're free to look into the prisons of the world, not with any sense of arrogance, but in a sense to say and recognize that some of the great lights of our time have been and are imprisoned. Look at Aung San Suu Kyi, the recent Nobel Peace Prize winner, the woman who was voted by her citizens in Burma, the head of state, remains imprisoned, detained, unable to move. So the conscience of the world, the light of the world, is often imprisoned. And unless we can look in there and work to set them free, then what does our freedom mean to us? Does it mean simply the pursuit of our own activities? We're talking about a level of brutality in the world that people are not free from, that most of you cannot imagine. You really may think certain things in your imagination that are horrible in the world. I can assure you, if you sit down and you read Amnesty International's reports on torture in the world, you'll find out that the world is more cruel and depraved than you could ever have imagined. In many continents, 1/3 of the world's governments systematically torture their citizens. That's not a little bit of slapping, punching around, knocking people about. This is systematic torture where they have the torture center, they have the equipment to torture, where men and women and children are tortured. We're talking about countries like Turkey today where people still die under torture. We're talking about countries like India that people sometimes view as a paragon of democracy in the East. Let me give you one case of Manoj Singh, 12-year-old kid in Delhi, picked somebody's pocket. Yeah, he stole something. Police caught him. We actually have a picture of his face as the police carried him away, and it's a picture of terror, and rightly so, because Manoj was tortured to death. And can you imagine a 12-year-old child being tortured to death? And what is our responsibility in relation to it? To leave it as a fact and to go on with our lives? His father went to the prison. He went to the police. He tried to get justice. He didn't get it. And we too need to be there as a voice. We cannot memorialize things like the Holocaust as somehow sacred in history and not go into our own times with eyes open and ears open and hearts open and say, what is happening in my day? And as was mentioned earlier, the airwaves are open, the communication channels are there. The media, it doesn't pick up a lot, at least of the extent of what is happening, but it does pick up some. You cannot say that you don't know. You may have inklings, you may have a little information, but each person in this room knows that in Latin America and in Africa and in Asia and in many parts of the world, there's a level of brutality that must be stopped. And we're set up as an organization to say we can stop it. Slavery was abolished, we can abolish torture. We need some sense of a vision of what human life is about. And if the vision of human life is only going to the malls and is only our own recreation and our own exercise, then I think it's a very deadly and limited view of human life on the planet, and one that will catch up with us. Indeed, we have to look into our own society. We have to look at the 20,000 homicides per annum in the United States and say, what is causing this level of carnage? And Amnesty would say, if you've got an act of violence and brutality, don't mirror it with another act of violence. Mahatma Gandhi said, an eye for an eye will only seek to make the whole world blind. And so we would say the death penalty is a form of blindness. Yes, society needs to be protected from dangerous people. But don't kill people to prove that killing people is wrong. Human life, the vision of human civilization, has to go beyond that. So we have things to look at here, too. And the United States should be proud. Its ambassadors and its human rights officials who have promoted human rights in various parts of the world. Ambassador Barnes, who stood in Chile at the funeral of Rodrigo Rojas, another child, another young man, who was burned alive by the Chilean military, doused with gasoline and burned alive. He and another girl thrown in a ditch. They crawled out of the ditch in that unspeakable suffering of the flesh. Finally ended up in a hospital that was 1 block away from the best burn unit in Latin America. And they wouldn't take those kids to it. They held them in the hospital around the corner because the director of the hospital said, well, they must be political if the military did this to them, and we better. And so Rodrigo died, and his mother, who lives in Washington, D.C., and he had gone back to Chile to photograph things. His mother sits at his bed and experiences the total unfreedom of terror and torture. She herself, who had been tortured and had fled to Chile. This is unfreedom, to have this level of brutality, that you yourself were tortured and your child is burnt to death. And Ambassador Barnes, the U.S. ambassador to Chile, walked at his funeral. When they threw water cannon, he stayed with them. Ambassador Hempston in Kenya said to me before he left, you know, I'm a political appointee. I don't know a lot about human rights. I've been told you kind of keep quiet and you work behind the scenes. Well, thank God his heart told him and not the policy of the administration. His heart spoke when he got there. He started holding dissidents in the embassy. He started speaking to the government very directly. What you're doing is wrong, imprisoning these dissidents and political activists. Melissa Wells, ambassador to Mozambique, so inspired by her sense of human rights, that many children in Mozambique were named Melissa after her. And Melissa went from Mozambique to Zaire. And you know what has been happening in Zaire. So yes, there are things that as we look at the US government, as I do, there are things to be proud of. There are things, individuals who really have a vision and who are willing to put themselves on the line. But there are also things that are wrong. There's clearly questions that need to be asked when the major recipients of military assistance from the US are engaged in human rights violations. We think of Morocco. There was a torture center, a center in the Atlas Mountains, very remote fort called Tasmamert, and I was able to testify before Congress on this last year. And fortunately, as I spoke, I said, look, Amnesty has received a letter from one of the guards there. It's a remarkable thing, this letter, because it tells us what we have known, that the Tasmamert is a truly terrible place of human persecution. And the guard himself, so sickened by it, secretly wrote to us. And he said, the prisoners are skeletal. They lie over slabs of cement like gray skeletons. You hardly know if they're alive or dead. And many have died because of the extreme cold, the harshness of the conditions, the lack of food. And I read his letter before Congress. And perhaps the Moroccan government was planning to do this anyway. Perhaps the pressure had been building. But a few months later, the Moroccan government announced that they were closing Tasmamert, that the dungeon was closing up. That is the power of knowing, of having the information and telling the story. We must tell the story of our time as it is. And we don't need to tell it with anger and hatred. We don't need to say that because there is torture in Turkey and Morocco, that the Turks and the Moroccans and their culture and their people are brutal and uncivilized, and that they as a culture are all wrong. We don't need to do that. We need to focus on the act itself and tell them, it is not within your tradition. It is not within the tradition of Islam to brutalize people. It is not the tradition within Hinduism to brutalize people. And listen, because we do have the information. And in all the years that I've been in Washington, and all the officials I've met with from governments and their representatives and special envoys, I have never heard one say, yes, I'm proud that we torture. Yes, we're a good torturing nation. No. Nobody defends torture. But what you need is the information. And they may have as now the trend in Washington, public relations firms that help gloss over the image, that help improve the image of the country. And you come along as a concerned citizen, as one perhaps who is using your freedom of information, and you say, I know something. I know that you're holding this person or that you've tortured that person. And information is power. And we who live in this information resourced and information abundant and technologically abundant country can use that information to save lives and to stop torture. We have a tremendous power. We have a key for the planet. And we must pick it up. Because in a total ethical sense, we are as responsible as the people in Germany who said, I didn't know it was going on. I had no idea. Well, it wasn't me. I mean, they came for the Jews first, and then they came for the gypsies, and then they came for the homosexuals. But finally, they'll come for you. That was an experience. That was a voice out of Nazi Germany. A voice of regret that the eyes and ears and heart were not opened to the peacemaking possibilities of the time. And now the peacemaking possibilities of everybody in this room, every person in this room is wealthy, is so resourced. You can get to a computer, you can get to a fax, you can get to a newspaper, you can speak to a television. And that information really affects governments because nobody likes to be known as a torturer. And once the information is out, it has to be dealt with. And Amnesty is so full of stories of how that has worked. A few letters come to a prisoner in Latin America. And he said, after the first letters arrived, I got my clothes back. And some more letters arrived in the prison. And I started to get fed a proper diet. And some more letters arrived, and they informed senior government officials that letters were pouring to the prison. And I started to get family visits. And then the president was informed, and I was set free. Information is power, and you have it. Use it. We have the information for you. We research it. We research it without ideological preference. We're not interested in right versus left. We're interested in the human. We say, and it's a tremendous story, I believe, that Amnesty has now got offices in 48 countries and members in over 100 countries. It's a tremendous story of the 20th century. It is saying, people, we can come together despite our ideological differences, despite our religious differences, despite the differences of color and ethnicity and race, and say, look, behold, the human. And history before trapped that. It said, oh no, nationality, different religion, different clan, different tribe. Now look at what we're facing. Look at that horizon, that we can look above that. Celebrate the difference, yes, but look through it and say, you are as much a human being as I am, and I vow to protect your right to be human, to be free, to think your thoughts, to live out your life. What a story. What a conspiracy of hope. We have been called a conspiracy of hope. And while we document the darkness and the depravity of government repression, our image is a candle in barbed wire. And we like to say we've been inspired by a Chinese proverb that says, it is better to light one candle than to curse the darkness forever. Yes, we can go on cursing the darkness because it is dark. When street children are murdered in Brazil, it is dark. When children in Iraq have their eyes gouged out, it is dark. It is infernal. But let's not turn away from it. Let's use our freedom to turn into it, to look it in the face, and to hold the candle of hope. There have been prisoners that we haven't immediately gotten free. We don't have a magic wand. Yes, Amnesty has freed a lot of people and stopped the torture of a lot of people. There's a lot of work to be done. But it doesn't always work simply. But almost invariably, the candle works. The light shining works. Another prisoner wrote to us when he was finally released, and really, that was one of the cases that was very slow. And he said, it was Christmas Eve. Perhaps the guard was touched by some remembrance of what Christmas was about. And he had one of the letters that had been sent. It had been opened, of course. It looked as if it had been opened and thrown in the trash. Perhaps this guard thought, I'll do a Christmas act, and he picked the letter out of the trash. Because when the prison door opened and the guard threw in this crumpled piece of paper, the prisoner went and he read it, and it was a very short note, a note written by, I believe, a college student, at least somebody. And it said, "Take heart. We know you're alive. Keep up hoping. Best regards, Monica, from Amnesty International." And he said, that letter saved my life because it gave me hope. It was like Danilo Shumuk, one of the longest serving prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union, when he came out and held a press conference in Eastern Europe, and they said, how for 25 years could you take hard labor and the conditions and the hopelessness of it? He went into his pocket and he took a tiny little yellow piece of wax with a little piece of wire around it that he had obviously somehow made for himself in prison. And he said, "Amnesty, amnesty." And he went on to explain that amnesty didn't get him free. But knowing that people around the world who were in the free world knew about him, were writing, were seeking his release, that's what made him free. That's what restored his humanity, because humanity was dying in him. He couldn't see how humanity could survive. And humanity answered back, "We know you're there. We'll do everything we can. We're coming." And we did come home. The walls did collapse in Eastern Europe. But the freedom from fear and persecution and terror in so many parts of the world, that still has to happen. Look at Peru. You have the Maoist shining path, the most horrendous guerrilla insurgency in the world. Heads floating down the river, the Khmer Rouge. That's what the Shining Path is about. A very brutal Maoist terrorist insurgency. And on the other side, you have the forces of the government. And like our image of Gandhi, and our image of violence, the military seem to reflect the climate of violence because they too extrajudicially kill. They've been responsible for the raping of school children. Rape, and when you're raped by the security forces, that is torture. Rape by the Peruvian military is very frequent. And actually, the number of killings on both sides is almost equal. And Amnesty wrote a report entitled, "Caught Between Two Fires." Let me tell you one or two stories before I conclude. Stories about how we can use our freedom for the unfree. How being free is really work for prisoners and peacemakers and human rights activists. Amnesty found out some years ago about a woman whose name was Noor Jahan in Burma. And when we heard about Noor, she was almost 30 years old. And Noor had been imprisoned when she was aged 1. So Noor's life was totally unfree. The forces of repression in the world had taken her life completely. From age 1, she breathed the prison climate. She didn't see the mountains. She had never seen the sea. All of the things that the free take for granted, the clouds and the trees, Noor Jahan did not know. What was her crime? What crime could a 1-year-old commit? The crime of being who she was, her identity, her mother's identity. So we started to launch a campaign on Noor's behalf. And in Washington, D.C., we asked a group of inner-city high school and middle school kids to take up her case, to send cards on her behalf, to publicize it. And a group of students got together and they did a play, a little dramatic story about Noor's life. And they took it to other schools and churches, and wherever they went, at the end of the performance, they would go through the audience with 100 to 150 cards to the Burmese government, asking the Burmese government to set her free and telling them that we knew. And Noor was freed. And she finally had her chance to walk on a beach, to look at a mountain, to experience basic freedom. And there, the free and the unfree worked together. And in an amazing sense, the students who participated in that told me afterwards it was one of the most important things that they had ever done. That it really did free them. It gave them a new reason to be concerned and to see that through telling and work that they could affect another life, that they could open the doors of a prison. Jamal Benomar in Morocco was imprisoned for 11 years because the king didn't like the things he was saying. Never did a violent thing in his life. He wrote some things, he said some things The king didn't like it, put him away for 11 years. Amnesty found out. We launched a campaign. We have campus chapters. We have about 4,000 campus chapters of Amnesty in the US. We have local community groups that take a prisoner case like you would adopt a child. In fact, they call it an adoption. And they work on that case until something happens, until either the prisoner is freed or dies. They don't take this case this week and that case next week. The adoption groups, they will adopt a case. Well, a group in England was one of the groups that had adopted Jamal. There may have been general campaigns, but this was the group that worked on his behalf. And one of the people in the group felt so strongly that she decided herself to go to Morocco and to go to the prison and to tell the prison warden that she was a British citizen who was concerned about Jamal Ben Omar, who was being held. And she got to see Jamal and made many visits to him. And they were kind of a little bit scared and worried and, well, what's this British woman doing here? And, better at least let him see her. The press could follow this story. And because of her actions and the actions of others, Jamal was released. And Jamal actually married that woman. And Jamal is now the program advisor to President Jimmy Carter at his Human Rights and Peace Center in Atlanta. And he continues to use his life for the cause of human rights and peacemaking. So I'm asking you to look at the possibilities. We do have to be patient. That's correct. We can't wave a magic wand and make the world better overnight. We somehow have to begin, though, with appreciating our freedom. So I ask you, when you walk outside, you look up at the sky, and if you're lucky and see the sun, remember that sun shines on us all. That sun shines over the planet. That sun shines into the cruelty and the hidden places of the world. We live under that one sun. It is not such a mystery that we should feel so locked off and isolated from what is happening in the planet. That perhaps for me is a symbol. It's the one sun that shines on us all, those who think we are free, those that are unfree, and that we can use our resources. Amnesty has one network. You don't have to go to meetings. You don't have to do as I do and beg politicians for people's lives. But you can write letters. It's called the Freedom Writers Network. And the Freedom Writers receive every month information about the unfree. And they write letters. And if you think in this devastatingly cruel world that writing a letter is too humble and namby-pamby an act, remember what I said about information and power. That those who send information do not realize what a resource it is. It It really does threaten governments when hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people around the world tell them, we know what you're doing, and stop it. And we want those people to be free. And then we can share and celebrate our freedom together. We can be, in the sense that Martin Luther King was calling and using his freedom, free at last, free at last. Thank God I am free at last. It is now 10:50, and I believe any student who wants to move on to another activity or class may do so. I will be happy to take questions. If we wait for a few minutes, those who want to leave and whoever would like to stay and ask questions, I'll be happy to take questions.
Mr. O'D, I wanted to know if we're really interested in what Amnesty International is doing, where we begin. Will you leave a brochure around as to who we would contact somewhere here at the college, and let us know where that would be?
Yeah, I will make sure that, since I have you both as contact people, that I send you information both on general brochures about Amnesty and its work, but also on the student movement within Amnesty. As I said, there are thousands of campus chapters around the country, and they are a very important dimension of our work, and I'll be very happy to make sure that we share that information with you.
Yes. I'd like to ask, what determines if a certain prisoner's case is taken up? Are there certain requirements as far as the type of cases that Amnesty deals with?
For people we call prisoners of conscience, we say that a prisoner of conscience is somebody who is imprisoned because of their religious views, their ethnicity, their race, their identity, their sexuality, who has never used or advocated violence. So that's where we make that definition. And we say a prisoner of conscience should be unconditionally freed, that nobody should be imprisoned for their beliefs, for their freedom of expression, for who they are. And where we document prisoners of conscience, we try to organize people around the world to work on their behalf. With other political prisoners, we say that again, all political prisoners should have a fair trial. Now, even if political prisoners have been involved in street riots, have been involved in violent activities, have called for armed activities against the government, we say that still everybody should have a fair trial, and that nobody should be tortured, to get false or make false statements. But we don't seek their release. We simply say that they should have a fair trial. That's the kind of the two areas that we decide. And that's the kind of basic difference between a prisoner of conscience and a general political prisoner. And in our work, we try to focus on individuals and also on the larger picture of both. Obviously, we will work on behalf of anybody who's tortured too, to stop their torture. We also try to look at the larger picture where possible, because sometimes you have such an interconnection of repression that you need to look at the larger picture. But it's very important to us to keep also the focus of the individual, because there are a number of groups that talk in general about conditions in countries and the policies that should be changed. And what we try to say is, let's actually save lives and work at least in practical ways as well as in more general prescriptive ways. Yes?
You were talking about other countries and everything, but what are you doing about the death penalty in America?
We issued a report a few years ago about the death penalty in the United States, and it is very shocking. It shows that most countries in the world have abolished, at least abandoned executing people for juvenile offenses, if they killed while juveniles. As you know, many states in the United States still execute people who were juveniles at the time of the crime. We said in that report that stuff that is pretty widely known, that there seems to be clear racial bias in the application of the death penalty, that minorities are executed more, and that what appears to be the central issue is the race of the victim. So if a black kills a black, you generally don't have as hot a push to execute them. If a black kills a white, you almost universally will have a call for the death penalty. And amnesty sections in Europe, because Europe, as you may know, has abolished the death penalty completely for all time. There is no death penalty in Europe. Our European sections in particular have tried to exert pressure on the United States to change. And they will go in and meet US ambassadors to Rome and London and tell them that there were 2 million Italians who petitioned on one particular death penalty case. Mother Teresa, Pope Paul, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a lot of global figures actually asked for clemency in a number of death penalty cases in that happen in the United States. But as you know, and then we do have an office in New York that looks at the death penalty here. And one of the things that is clear is you can't, in the present climate, go out and say totally abolish it, because it's not the climate. So what we have tried to do is to stop the execution of juveniles, stop the execution of mentally retarded. As you know, also in many states, they feel that you can execute retarded citizens. And also the mentally ill. State of Virginia and state of Texas have executed people that Amnesty considered mentally ill. One man was a double schizophrenic who was executed. So it is on our agenda. And we have other concerns in the United States too, related to refugees, that we try to prevent the United States sending refugees back to situations where we have evidence that they might be tortured or killed. But I would say those are the two main areas of focus. Yes?
Wondering what sources you have for information. Do you have an information network, or do you just rely on individuals to report incidences?
Mm-hmm. We have a large research, our central research office is in London, and the staff in London is several hundred people. And they gather information from multiple sources. At one point, when we published a report on Guatemala, and we showed a diagram of the presidential palace and an annex to the presidential palace, and the exact location of a torture center within the annex to the presidential palace, the government of Guatemala was a little bit confused as to where we were getting our information from. And in fact, I'm not going to reveal that, but information can come from within government sources. It can come from judges, lawyers, teachers, clergy people. It can come from journalists from around the world. It can come from business people who visit countries. It will come from the families and colleagues themselves. One of the things that Amnesty tries to do, we gather the information, and in places like North Korea, there are a few places still like that where it's still very difficult to gather information, but generally that's not the problem. The problem becomes, how do you verify the information? And our standard is that we need 3 independent sources before we will say Amnesty reports that, and then we will actually send missions to the country ourselves to give our own final verification.
This morning over breakfast you brought up an issue that's kind of been on my mind for a number of years, and that is what makes a torturer. And you said that the Amnesty International has a video regarding the creation of people who are torturers, how that happens to them. I'd like you to say a few words about that, and also I was wondering if perhaps you'd be willing to send us a copy of that for our use in classes and campus organizations.
I'll certainly speak to the regional office about trying to get you the video. The video is called Your Neighbor's Son, The Making of a Torturer. And it really shows how anybody can be inducted into that process, that within the initiations within a military apparatus and the process of conditioning somebody, deconditioning them perhaps to certain kinds of sensitivities, toughening them in certain ways, routinely requesting them to follow various kinds of order patterns, you can make a torturer. And that's one thing that I think we need to look at more, is as we push and push against those who commit human rights abuses. We've got to try to develop more psychological information and understanding as to what creates the psychology of violence. Because you have people who believe that they are upstanding citizens, who are defending their country, who are doing the right thing. And I think it's a psychological issue because the mind becomes so polarized. And I think one of the keys is in the other, in the projection of the other.